Hey there, ready to dive in?
Always.
You sent over some seriously interesting research on climate change solutions.
Yeah.
And honestly, one thing is just glowing red hot right now, solar geoengineering.
Oh, yeah. It's certainly timely. With that UN Environment Assembly debate, it's clear this isn't just theoretical anymore.
Right. It feels like the whole world's kind of going back and forth on this one.
Yeah, it's sparking some serious debate globally for sure.
Yeah, and you've got like some folks saying, hey, this could be our Hail Mary, this could be it. And others are like waving huge red flags
Yeah.
about all the things that could go wrong.
Yeah.
But before we go down that rabbit hole, let's rewind a sec.
Okay.
For anyone listening who's like, solar what now?
Huh.
Can you give us the quick explainer?
Okay, so in the simplest terms, imagine like turning down the sun's heat just a notch.
Okay.
Obviously, we can't actually dim the sun.
Right.
But what we're talking about with solar geoengineering, specifically stratospheric aerosol injection, is essentially mimicking a volcanic eruption.
Okay, that sounds kind of intense. And also maybe a little terrifying.
It's the same principle as Mount Pinatubo back in '91.
Okay.
Remember that eruption?
Yeah, vaguely.
Spewed millions of tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere,
Oh, right.
creating a sort of hazy shield
Yeah.
that actually cooled the planet
Okay.
by about 0.5 degrees Celsius for a year or so.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
So it's basically like we create a man-made volcanic haze to like deflect sunlight.
Exactly. We'd be talking about sending up a fleet of planes to release these tiny reflective particles into the stratosphere. It sounds like sci-fi.
It does.
But the technology is actually within reach, which is part of what makes it so compelling.
Right.
And also a little scary.
For sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so digging into the stuff you sent, one thing that really jumped out at me, and it's kind of about Australia's stance on this whole thing.
Okay, yeah.
You'd think a country famous for its sunshine would be like leading the charge on researching how to maybe, dial it back a bit.
Right.
But that doesn't seem to be the case.
And yet, Australia, despite being incredibly vulnerable to climate change impacts, we're talking bushfires, droughts, the Great Barrier Reef, literally bleaching, has been surprisingly quiet on the solar geoengineering front, particularly compared to countries like the US, the UK, even Canada.
Which is kind of wild to me because I distinctly remember all that stuff about Australia's cloud brightening experiments.
Right.
Over the Great Barrier Reef, they were trying to protect the coral
Yeah.
from bleaching, right?
Yeah.
Wasn't that a form of solar geoengineering, even if it was smaller scale?
It was, and a controversial one at that.
Hmm.
It was the first attempt to use marine cloud brightening to cool a reef, and it drew criticism from environmental groups worldwide.
Really?
Some applauded the innovation, but others saw it as a dangerous distraction from the real issue, cutting emissions.
Oh, interesting. So kind of like a, hey, look over there while planet's burning.
Yeah, kind of.
So Australia's dipped a toe in the water, but they're not diving in head first?
Exactly. And one of the reasons for that hesitation might be the sheer complexity of it all. Because, as you've probably read, the effects of solar geoengineering wouldn't be uniform across the globe.
Right.
What might benefit one region could actually harm another.
Yeah, that's true. One of the articles mentioned that some climate models suggest that, yeah, solar geoengineering might reduce overall global temperatures,
Right.
but it could also lead to like changes in rainfall patterns.
Yeah?
And I can't help but think, what if, say, the U.S. decided to just go for it? Temperatures drop globally, but it also disrupts monsoons in Asia or causes droughts in Australia.
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question and concern. Because if that were to happen, who's to blame? Who's responsible for the unintended consequences?
Right.
And this isn't just a hypothetical scenario we're talking about.
Right.
Scientists are already using sophisticated computer models.
Oh, yeah, like
GeoMIP.
Yeah, that's the one. Can you remind me what that stands for again?
It stands for the Geoengineering Model Intercomparison Project. Essentially, it's a massive international collaboration where scientists use complex computer models to simulate different geoengineering scenarios
Okay.
and study their potential regional and global impacts. They're not perfect,
Right.
but these models are giving us a glimpse into how tweaking the climate in one part of the world could create ripple effects elsewhere.
It's like a real-life game of Simurth, but with much higher stakes.
Yeah.
Speaking of high stakes, this whole discussion reminds me of that book, The Ministry for the Future. Have you read that?
I have. It's a favorite among some in the intelligence community for a reason.
It's terrifyingly plausible.
Yeah.
India, devastated by a deadly heat wave, takes matters into its own hands and deploys solar geoengineering,
Right.
sparking international chaos.
Yeah, it highlights a very real concern that many experts have: the potential for unilateral action in the absence of clear international agreements.
Because right now, there really aren't any binding global rules when it comes to governing this technology. Not really, no.
We're talking about potentially altering the entire planet's climate.
Yeah.
And there's no rule book. That's alarming, to say the least.
It's a massive gap in global governance.
Yeah.
And it raises some very serious questions. Who gets to decide if, when, and how this technology is used? Who's responsible for monitoring its effects? What happens if something goes wrong?
Okay, so we've established that this isn't just about tinkering with the planet's thermostat. It's about navigating a geopolitical minefield with potentially huge consequences.
Exactly. Exactly. And one of the most concerning aspects, as you mentioned, is that right now there's no global consensus on whether this technology should even be researched, let alone deployed.
It's a bit like we're all standing around a giant red button arguing about whether it's even a good idea to see what it does. But while that debate rages on, there are some scientists, policymakers, and even those fiction writers we mentioned who are already thinking about the potential consequences if someone were to push that button. And some of those potential consequences are pretty daunting. One that sends chills down my spine is the idea of termination shock.
Okay, I have to admit, that one sounds pretty ominous. Break it down for us. What exactly is termination shock?
Imagine this. We managed to get solar geoengineering up and running. Temperatures stabilize, maybe even start to go down a bit. But then, for whatever reason, political instability, maybe, or global pandemic, even a major volcanic eruption, the program has to stop abruptly.
You're saying we could turn down the Earth's thermostat, but we might not be able to turn it back up without things going haywire.
Precisely. If we were to suddenly stop injecting these aerosols into the atmosphere, the planet could experience decades worth of pent-up warming in a very short period of time. We're talking potentially catastrophic temperature spikes within a matter of years, if not sooner.
So not just a red button, but a red button that, once pushed, might be impossible to unpush without setting the whole thing on fire. Okay, that's a whole other level of terrifying. It really highlights why this whole governance issue is so crucial.
Absolutely, and why it's so concerning that, as your research points out, there are no international agreements in place to regulate this technology. We need to be having these conversations now at a global level to establish clear guidelines, ethical frameworks, and accountability mechanisms.
Especially since, as we've been discussing, the impacts of solar geoengineering won't respect borders. What one nation or even a handful of nations decide to do could have ripple effects across the entire planet.
And that brings us back to Australia's position, which, as your research highlighted, is particularly interesting. Australia, geographically isolated, highly vulnerable to climate change, and with a history of being a bit of hesitant to engage in global climate agreements, is at a crossroads. Do they watch from the sidelines as other countries potentially reshape the planet's climate? Or do they step up and become a key player in shaping how or even if solar geoengineering moves forward?
It's interesting you put it that way because one of the articles you shared brought up a really intriguing point. If Australia were to seriously research or hypothetically even consider deploying solar geoengineering, should they go it alone? Or should they collaborate with their neighbors, particularly those in the Pacific who, let's be honest, would be on the front lines of any unintended consequences?
It's a question with huge ethical and geopolitical implications. On the one hand, Australia, like any nation, has a right to explore potential solutions to a problem that directly threatens its future. But on the other hand, acting unilaterally on a technology with such far-reaching consequences could be seen as incredibly reckless, even potentially hostile.
Especially given that many Pacific Island nations are already facing the brunt of climate change. Rising sea levels, more intense cyclones, their very existence is at stake. I imagine their perspective on something as potentially risky as solar geoengineering would be quite different from, say, a country like Australia, which, while vulnerable, isn't facing immediate existential threats from climate change.
Precisely. Which is why, in many ways, the most responsible and strategically advantageous path forward for Australia would be one of collaboration, particularly with its Pacific neighbors.
Okay, so let's say Australia decides to go down that road to make collaboration a cornerstone of its approach to solar geoengineering. What would that actually look like in practice? Because it sounds like it would be incredibly complex to get right. It definitely brings a whole other layer of complexity to the table. I mean, where do you even begin to build that kind of collaborative framework, especially when you're talking about something as potentially like world-altering as solar geoengineering?
It wouldn't be easy, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But I think one of the most critical first steps would be for Australia to just acknowledge the power imbalance at play here.
You're saying they need to recognize that they're the ones with the resources and the scientific infrastructure, while a lot of Pacific Island nations are already just stretched thin dealing with the day-to-day realities of climate change.
Exactly. Any collaboration has to be built on a foundation of mutual respect and understanding where Pacific voices are not just heard,
Right.
but actively sought out, prioritized.
Yeah.
It can't just be a case of, we're going to do this research and let you know the results.
It's more about saying, we're facing this global challenge together, so what are your concerns? What are your priorities? And how can we work together to make sure that any research, any decisions made about solar geoengineering are done in a way that benefits everyone, not just a select few?
Right. It's about recognizing that Pacific Island nations have centuries of traditional knowledge about their environment, about weather patterns, about adapting to change. That knowledge is invaluable.
Yeah.
And frankly, it's something that often gets overlooked in these big global discussions.
Yeah, it's like we were saying before, it's not just about like sharing information, it's a genuine shift in mindset. Treating Pacific Island nations as equal partners, not just as stakeholders to be consulted.
Absolutely.
Or worse, placated.
And that involves transparency, accountability, and a willingness to listen and learn from each other.
Which, let's be real, hasn't always been Australia's, like, strong suit
Right.
when it comes to engaging with the Pacific on climate change. I mean, there's a lot of skepticism, and rightfully so, about whether this time would be any different.
And that skepticism is completely valid. Building trust takes time, especially when it's been eroded by past actions, but actions speak louder than words. If Australia were to genuinely commit to a collaborative approach, demonstrating through concrete actions that they're serious about putting the needs and concerns of their Pacific neighbors front and center, it could be a game changer.
It could even, as you were saying earlier, position Australia as a leader in, like, responsible geoengineering governance. Imagine that.
It's a powerful image, isn't it?
Yeah.
Australia is stepping up and saying, we're not going to rush into this blindly. We're going to work with our neighbors, learn from each other, and strive to find solutions that work for everyone. That could send a powerful signal to the rest of the world.
Wow, okay. This whole conversation has really been eye-opening. We started with a seemingly simple question about solar geoengineering, and we've ended up like grappling with some of the biggest challenges facing humanity. Climate change, global inequality, international cooperation,
Yeah.
the weight of the future itself. It's a lot to process.
It is, but as overwhelming as it can feel, these are conversations we need to be having because the choices we make today about whether to pursue technologies like solar geoengineering and how we choose to govern them will have profound implications for generations to come.
Absolutely. And on that note, we'll leave you with this final thought to ponder. If Australia did decide to fully embrace collaboration, not just in word, but in deed, how might that reshape its role, not just in the Pacific, but on the world stage? What would it mean for the future of solar geoengineering and for global governance as a whole? It's a complex issue with no easy answers, but by engaging in these conversations, by considering diverse perspectives, and by demanding transparency and accountability from our leaders, we can at least strive to create a future where we're all in this together. Thanks for diving deep with us today.